I'll say that a little louder. There is coffee if anybody needs it up by the front. Ben's offering to share.
Okay, welcome back to meeting of the Market Surveillance Committee. We are continuing now with the second major agenda item, and Amelia will be continuing her presentation on behalf of DMM about system-wide market power.
So when we left, we were a few slides ahead, but I'll just start a few slides back just to get everybody in the same place. We were looking at a difference between the bidding behavior of net buyers and net sellers. What you see in general is that net buyers are bidding in below their default energy bids. That's their reference price. And this is for gas resources only. And net sellers are bidding in above their default energy bids and reference prices. Another set of bids that we looked at were import bids. This chart makes a distinction between RA imports in red and non-RA imports, which are in blue. What you can see is that we have a substantial portion of RA imports that are up at the top of the supply curve, as well as some self-schedule. One of the other metrics that we've used to look at the potential impact of market power is a comparison of our system marginal energy cost to the highest DEB segment of any gas resource dispatched on that day. So the green line on this chart lists for each hour the price in dollars per megawatt hour of the highest DEB segment, and the red line shows the system marginal energy cost. Michelle?
Yeah. So does this reflect the gas prices for that particular day as well then when you're developing the default energy bid? Is this your developed or their?
Yes.
Okay.
This reflects the updated gas. This is day ahead. So it reflects the as updated in the day ahead market gas price index used for that. This is actually two different resources, but for that resource on that day.
And on June 21st, did you guys mitigate for local market power? So were any of these bids mitigated? Would they have been mitigated, possibly?
They could possibly have been mitigated, yeah.
If they were, local?
If they were in a locally constrained area.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Brian Baker with NRG. You're showing the SMEC. The SMEC could be set, that price could have been set by an import, by a virtual.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What we see is that in some hours, that value is higher than the highest DEB segment, and that was true across 2017 in 64 hours. So it's not a high percent, but it's in a number of hours. One of the others.
I'm sorry, if I can follow up. I seem to remember in the discussion from last year's peak load that DMM had presented some information on just what kinds of resources were setting price in those high price hours. Do I misremember?
We did present, and actually Guillermo's here, and Guillermo presented some information on that as well in the MPPF. Okay. So when you look at this is quite a few slides back now, but for those of you online, when you look at the day-ahead supply curves, what you see is a lot of the capacity being offered as incremental energy at the top of the supply stack is from virtual supply.
Thanks.
Yeah, which happened to set the price in those high price hours on June 21st. So.
I'm sorry to take so much time now, but in the this is Michelle Keto again. But in the comparison that you were showing of resources that were bidding above and below the default energy bid, those are real resources, right?
Yes, those are real resources. Those are only gas resources internal to the ISO.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. One of the other things that we look at, and this came up earlier in the discussion of imports, are comparisons of our cost to prices elsewhere in the bilateral market, and we tend to look at Palo Verde and Mitzi. What we see when we compare, and this is comparing the package of peak hours, is that in general, our system marginal energy price tends to be higher on most days than prices in the bilateral market. What we see that, and then you can see the spike in September 1st when our load was 1 in 19, I think Guillermo said earlier, and was also systematically higher than prices elsewhere in the West, is that sometimes our prices are much higher than the rest of the bilateral market.
Amelia, one more question, Michelle Keto. But on those particular days, you remember you also showed a slide showing that we had less imports.
Right.
Do those days where California has a price spike also correspond with those days when less imports are showing up at our border?
Some of them do.
Okay, thank you.
And this is my, I think, last slide, but one of the other things that we looked at was the correlation of our RS3 measure with system marginal energy prices in 2017. So correlation is not causation. Some of the same relatively tight supply conditions that could lead to having a highly concentrated market could also indicate scarcity in general, but what you do see is that when our market is most concentrated, we tend to have the highest energy prices. Where I'd like to end, and the real purpose of offering this discussion today, was to generate some discussion with the MSC of additional metrics or analysis that we ought to consider, any recommendations the MSC might have for mitigation, to ask for consideration of market power in proposed market changes, and any other ideas that the MSC would like to offer.
Okay. So competitive benchmarks will be seen that going forward sometime in the future. And when you do competitive benchmarks, they include scarcity pricing and
they do.
As well they should. Okay. In terms of recommendations for mitigation, well, it's not a recommendation, but just understanding what other ISOs do about system-wide market power, or don't do about system-wide market power. If I remember correctly, New York once tried, but were told by the courts not to implement conduct and input tests for upstate New York, which was a system-wide situation. New England uses, is that correct, a single supplier RSI, and that's okay by the courts, but nobody else worries about system-wide market power. Is that an apt characterization of what folks do worry about?
Everybody worries.
Sorry, yeah. Ben said worry about, and there's a difference between worry about and actively mitigate.
And actually have something in place to detect and react to it.
Sorry, this is Michelle Keto. But doesn't I feel like I've heard before that this market depends on a structurally competitive market, and that's why we don't do system-wide mitigation. But if you're now getting information that it's possible that it's not structurally competitive, isn't that concerning? It's the underpinning of the market, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's why I think this whole discussion is starting. You're right that the entire approach to mitigation is sort of predicated upon the system-wide being reasonably competitive, and that the market power that we need to focus on is localized, triggered by congestion. And so, none of this is definitive, conclusive, but we definitely want to think about. Everything has costs and benefits as well. So the degree to which you're willing to take mitigation, put mitigation frameworks in place for a rare event that's properly hedged by everybody in the market, it may not be worth trying to stamp out every iota of market power because of the cost of trying to do that. But that's where trying to sort of understand the likelihood now and going forward of system-wide and trying to sort of work through whether the underlying assumption that the system-wide is just fine, whether we can still be comfortable with that. I guess can I make my speech now? So I think the thing I'm worried about is that a lot of the health of not just this market, but a lot of electricity markets is sort of predicated upon most of the transactions happening through forward energy transactions. And, this market has had that for many, many years through the long-term procurement mechanism and other sorts of things, but primarily through the long-term procurement. And we're transitioning away from that paradigm now. And there's a lot of, I think at many different levels, the resource adequacy level and other levels, just even tax credits for renewable energy, whether the transition from regulated utility-centric procurement mechanism to whatever we're going to have now. We're going through at least a transition and maybe a new equilibrium where there's a lot less forward procurement happening right now, at least long-term forward procurement. And that means load is less hedged than they have been in the past, and that could also feed through to sellers' incentives. Sellers have more of an incentive to try to exercise market power when they are selling on the spot market if they don't have a forward contract. And so maybe this all feeds into some other things we need to think about in terms of where the California sort of structure writ large is going.
Hi, this is Guillermo from CAISO. I just have a principal question. So, how many hours would be acceptable to have this type of outcome, to have this discussion? For instance, if we were to tackle the hours where we handle the peak record of the year, is that still a case that we have to go after? What is the holy grail to say when this becomes an issue to address versus is just the cost benefit not there to be addressed?
Okay, I'll take a stab, but there isn't I can't say 12. There's sort of a so we'll have a fight. There's a framework. I was just trying to articulate basically the framework here, and we need to understand the tools we have for mitigating market power. We've just gone through this commitment cost default energy bid sort of process, and we don't necessarily know exactly with 100% accuracy what the default energy bid should be either, and so readjusting submissions to DEBs has a potential cost, both in terms of just getting it wrong, and then there may be long-run incentive issues associated with that. The cost of missing it and not mitigating, is definitely a function of where the backstop bid caps are, how hedged the market is, and other aspects of that. So 1 hour at a $100,000 price cap, is different than 1 hour at a $2,000 price cap, for example. But at least that's the framework that I think we should try to have in mind. It's that, mitigation of market power is not costless. And so we want to balance the degree to which we want to take those steps with the benefits it's providing in terms of trying to eliminate the market power we're concerned about.
So a number of years ago, FERC got rid of the West-wide must-offer obligations. That doesn't seem costly to reimpose.
Well, okay, so this is a whole, this relates to, I think, my rant on RA, that I think we put too much faith in things like must-offer requirements and, sort of ignore the economic aspects of that. And goes back to the crisis was, primarily the issue was bankrupt load-serving entities that could not pay suppliers. That was a function of all sorts of high prices that preceded that. And so just having the physical resources being forced to offer at any price does not provide the types of hedging we would like to see the market take the positions on.
Yeah, but the must-offer is really about the Enron schemes that were going on, right? So, yes, maybe the utilities were bankrupt, but let's not forget that there were schemes to withhold the energy from the California market. And
well, okay, not to get through this, Enron, I don't want to sort of, Enron did not have a big physical position. So must-offer requirements are about whether a generator should be selling into the market, and that just takes you down this sequence that we've been trying to work through for 15 years about what exactly is a must-offer requirement. How flexible should it be? If it's self-scheduled, is that adequate enough? You know, what's a must-offer requirement for a limited energy resource? It's a really complicated concept to implement in practice that I think when the West-wide must-offer was originally put in place, people didn't really fully grasp all of the complexities that underlie the idea of a must-offer requirement. I think fundamentally, though, it is sort of submitting your unit to whatever market power mitigation paradigm a system is putting in place. And so the effectiveness of a must-offer requirement is tied to what types of market power mitigation are
okay, so am I hearing that you don't support that then? You don't like that particular route?
Well, I think must-offer requirements get you less than I think a lot of people think. And so it all depends on what, you know, again, what the costs of trying to impose the must-offer requirement, and it's not as simple as, you know, bid every hour. And so I don't think it gets you nearly as much in terms of market power mitigation as I think people thought back 15 years ago. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so you don't think it's something that should be considered under the current context?
I mean, everything should be considered. I wouldn't think of it as, it wouldn't be my first choice as a solution to a system-wide market power problem in California.
And so what would your first choice be?
Well, I'm not sure there's any, I don't know if we know that any actions need to be taken. I think the first thing I would really like to see as something we think about is that whether load is hedging their energy costs as well as their RA obligations.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. But yeah, and generally regulators might have some insight into that, but given the structure of the current market, we don't. So the legislation was set up so that the Public Utilities Commission oversees the utilities procurement, and there are hedging and there are bundled plans. You probably know exactly how this all works. But to the extent that they're not the majority, they're not serving the majority of load, the oversight of, you know, other entities is very unclear. I mean, maybe you could give us some insight into how this is handled in other jurisdictions. How do you oversee the hedging of load in other jurisdictions? So again, this is all really important questions, but probably not something we can resolve here. But I think there's legitimate discussions as to what falls under the rubric of an ISO's policy versus other sets of policies that influence the types of decisions a load-serving entity takes. They have to do with the implications of what happens when an LSE goes bankrupt, what the provider of last resort provisions are, what the right of return for customers, you know, are under those conditions. And all those things sort of form a set of incentives that LSEs face, as well as the governance of the LSEs themselves, which, you know, ultimately we're going to a direction in which all these local LSEs are going to be making choices on their own. I just think. Right, and I guess I'm asking, since you guys, you know, don't just look at this California market, I assume that you look at other markets. Mm-hmm. Where has it worked, and where, I mean, if hedging is so incredibly important, how do make sure that that forward contracting is occurring? Or do they not have system market power issues? Is that what you're saying, maybe? Well, I don't know.
I'll take the burden off him for a while. And I mean, I think, you know, it's not just that the people are hedging because of system market power. They're hedging because the market can get tight and they won't be able to pay for it. And ERCOT is a place where the price can go to $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, and the LSE will go bankrupt if they're not hedged. And they don't have multi-year hedges, but they're hedged for the next summer and the year. So you're hedging each year. And the ERCOT, you know, the PUC of Texas has let load-serving entities that aren't hedged go bankrupt. Mm-hmm. But they're just private retailers. They're not, the regulated utility, they're not CCAs. But the policy has been, you guys are toast, you're going to lose all your money, we're not going to bail you out, and you better hedge. And the ones that don't hedge go bankrupt, but it sends the message that by and large, the retailers are hedged, cover their positions. And, you've got a difficult problem. If you can't watch what some of these entities are doing and they're not sophisticated enough yet to hedging, I don't think you should be thinking about that problem as just system market power. You should be thinking about the problem of suppose it's a tight summer in the West and the real price is $400, and if you don't pay $400, the imports aren't going to show up and you're going to have to shed load, and system market power isn't going to do anything about that. And, that's what I would be worrying about, that's going to be the market clearing price. And maybe it's not this year. Maybe there's enough water in the West. This isn't going to be the year, but maybe next year is going to be the year. And that's, the issue of, like the very hot year in Texas where it really was really hot. And the prices really did get really, really tight. And it was a generator that lost, a generator even in the room that lost a huge amount of money because they couldn't cover their forward positions during that hot summer. And that shifts the risk. But I think we all ought to be really concerned about if we go into an environment where the load serving entities are not hedged, and just dealing with system market power won't solve that problem if we get high prices in the West. And if we're not import constrained and we can buy from other places in the West, we shouldn't have really high prices. So that's not about market power, but that's just about hedging, and hedging is really important, but it also, as Jim says, it does tend to ameliorate market power, because if the generator's always sold his power forward, he doesn't benefit from high prices. He actually gets hurt if he holds his power back and then he's a buyer. So it does work together. It ameliorates the impact on the load serving entities, and it has some beneficial effects on market power.
Yeah, so I took some verbal shortcuts here, but the big problem, especially with system-wide, is it's really hard to distinguish between a scarcity condition and market power. We know that when you're getting really close to scarcity, that's when market power is going to be the strongest. Sometimes it's very hard to identify on an event-by-event basis. In electricity, a lot of systems put in place to try to do that, but the issues to try to deal with scarcity as well as market power, the good news is that the same tools are effective at dealing with both of those, but there isn't a simple answer as to, what regulation do we put in place to make people sign the right hedges. I think people are struggling with that question in markets around the world, really. But it's not always that there is a single system-wide policy that's imposed that says you've got to sign this type of hedge contract. Usually it's more of an incentive sort of chain. I just bring all this up because I think it's been absent from the discussion of both kind of what's going on with RA, as well as, since system-wide market power was being presented, I think it's worth sort of bringing to mind again that the real consequences of system market power are tied to all of these knock-on kind of.
But is it also possible that as you get to a tighter system, that possibly a market doesn't really work in that context?
We don't think so. I think you could have a period of extremely tight, but it's all about over the long run. We think the market is a really good way of responding to those tight conditions. And that's sort of back to this cost benefit. And it may, if we can mitigate that market power during those scarce hours as effectively as possible, then the market mechanisms are giving us sort of the best way of trying to anticipate and plan for the right level of scarcity and the right amount of investment to deal with it. That's why sort of we kind of are here. But markets in a single hour where there's extremely tight supply are going to have these competitiveness challenges, but it is just for hopefully a short period of time, and there are tools to try to limit the damage while trying to still access the benefits over, the longer horizon.
So we're a half hour behind schedule, I'd like to see if there are any last questions or comments.
I want to make, a couple first things,
Yeah.
actually responsive to what you asked for. One thing that struck me is your diagram about all the phantom RA offered at $1,000. I gather you included that in the pivotal supplier test? Because it was offered in the day-ahead market at $1,000. I mean, a sensitivity case might be to say, okay, well, that stuff probably isn't there. It was offered at $1,000, so take all that stuff out of the day-ahead market, and what does it look like? Because if that isn't really meaningful competition, if A, it isn't really there, and B, it's offered at $1,000. So that would be one suggestion. Secondly, as I indicated earlier, I think we ought to be at least doing a sensitivity case where we put in the virtual supply, because we think a lot of the virtual supply is proxying for real resources. Beyond that, I think we ought to, another way of looking at that would be to look at the variable generation that shows up in real time that is in the day-ahead market and put that in. And, maybe none of those is the absolute truth, but between putting those various things in and seeing how the picture looks, it would give us a different view of what's going on. Fourthly, I think we ought to look at, well, if we've got all, your pictures and the reports of all that virtual supply on these high-price days, and then we have a low price in real time. What was that virtual supply proxying for? What are the resources that showed up in real time that weren't in the day-ahead market, and what does that imply for us? Do we need to do something about stronger incentives for the variable generators to be in the market? Do we have risks maybe in some of those solar ramping hours that people are not wanting to, maybe even goes to the 15-minute market will help that in the day-ahead market if the exposure of a flat hourly schedule in those hours is creating artificial risks. So I think we ought to, look at all those things to understand what's happening. So those are the comments I had.
Yeah, I haven't fully worked through what the right formation of this is, but the general spirit of the idea is to try to basically look at the actual load and the available bid-in supply between both the day-ahead and real-time. And maybe it's as simple as taking the variable energy resources and adding them to the day-ahead bid stack in some ways, if there's ways to take out the already bid-in or scheduled stuff, or maybe there's ways of combining inks with day-ahead bids or something that avoids double counting. But I think that's the spirit of what you're kind of trying to look for.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so at this time, we're going to get to the next agenda item, which is the Track 1B Congestion Revenue Rights Auction Efficiency discussion. We have two presentations. One on Scott is going to emphasize the congestion rent shortfalls and revenue inadequacy, show some data from other markets, and then we're also in the process of developing an opinion on Track 1B, and Jim has a presentation, some thoughts on that.
Okay, this is sort of just background information that I thought would be useful in the context of some of the discussion that's been had, and pulled together some data for other ISOs. We've all talked about congestion rent shortfalls, and they can have a lot of causes. I'm not going to go through it. It depends on a lot of characteristics about things that happen in the day-ahead market and how much of the system's been sold. But it's interesting to look at. One of the things that I highlighted in some of my other comments in other last couple of meetings is I think it's kind of striking how large the congestion rent shortfalls are in the CAISO market. And I thought that was striking to me, and I thought I'd put some numbers in front of everybody so you understood why I felt that way. And like the New York market is one that I think is good because of its structure and the incentives for the transmission owners. Outages are generally not modeled in the day-ahead market or in the auction. I mean, not modeled in the auction, but they are modeled in the day-ahead market. It's a decision that's not made by the ISO because of the structure of responsibility for outages. So actually the transmission owners decide whether or not they want an outage modeled in the auction, and they generally decide they don't want it modeled. So you're generally running an auction without any outages modeled in it. These are the data for the last 5 years, showing there are congestion rent shortfalls in the New York day-ahead market. but still the congestion rate collections are about 89, close to 90% of the target payout. And the difference is made up by the transmission owners that are responsible for the outages.
Scott, what is just clarifying question, in TCC, what is that?
Oh, that's their name for an FTR, but yeah, it's or a CCR. TCC equals FTR equals CCR, it's the same thing, it's just, back in the day, there were, these words were made, and now it stands for Transmission Congestion Contract, but it's just the same old thing.
One more question. Does this mean that the transmission owners in New York are you saying the cost now to the transmission owners in New York is this 11.5%?
Right.
They're just eating that.
Well, they're not eating it. They eat part of it. It's flowed through to the TFC, so it's passed on to FERC jurisdictional customers. But my understanding of the way the rates are set with the PSC, there's a strong incentive component because there's some targets and set, in the regulatory lag in the structure, they basically, if there's a problem, they eat it, unless they can go and say, well, it was a hurricane and it isn't our fault. But it isn't a direct, they eat it, but at the margin, they're eating it.
So it's not, I guess I'm trying to draw the distinction between the company itself taking on the loss, or is it passed through?
Some of it is passed through, but because of the rate design they have, some of it's going to end up on the shareholder's pocket. Conversely, if they do good, the regulatory structures are going to get to keep some of it. It also, I understand, it gives them the opportunity for third-party recoveries. I understand there's a major change of behavior in New York when this thing went into effect. It used to be that all the cell phone companies wanted the transmission owners to take towers out of service so they could put their cell phones up there because that was really convenient to have the cell receptors on the tower. And then when the NISO started giving them a bill so that you could go turn around and tell the cell phone company, well, this is what it cost us, and you're going to have to pay us. And the CPUC and all the regulators said, yes, you're going to have to pay them. They no longer decided that it was great business to take transmission towers out of service with cell phones. So there was a lot of, and the transmission owners changed their behavior as well. But there's a lot of things that changed. Not all of it was the transmission owners. Some of it was third parties. Yep.
Paul Grbic, PG&E. So you said that some of this cost is allocated to the transmission owner who had the outage. So if I'm a transmission owner and my line goes out, you try to determine how much of the shortfall is caused by my line being out, it's allocated to me. It's not peanut buttered across all transmission owners?
No, that's why this started, is that the peanut buttering was the way the system was in the early 2000s, and some of the transmission owners went apoplectic about the costs that were getting shuffled around the state. And this was put in place to isolate those costs to the part of the transmission owner that was responsible for it. And then through the rate design, there's some impact that it's not going to be able to pass all that through, so it has an incentive to do better.
Thank you.
Scott, I had a question about how you determine the responsibility for an outage. So if let's say we have a derate of a transmission line from 1,000 to 500, then the shift factors are the same. But if you have an outage that changes the shift factor, you're moving flows to other lines that then may get congested. And so do these calculations of responsibility account for these shifts?
I feel with power. If you look at it, if you want to really have an interesting evening, take attachment N to the NISO tariff and work through it, and I was involved in developing it, and we settled it for the first 8 years it was in place. So I know this in excruciating detail, and it works through all those situations, and it can be done. And, as I said earlier in one of our talks, one of the things the NISO does each month is they run a special case of the auction software, rerun it, and force all the constraints or binding in the day-ahead market to bind, so that they then have shift factors for every constraint they need for settlements. Because, you know, when we run our auction here, it might not bind. If it doesn't bind in the auction, you don't have the shift factors. But in fact, if you set up a process, you just go back and do that at the end of the month. You got all the shift factors. And as I'll get to in a couple minutes, that has other beneficials. The second bullet there is not only, you know, the process there for the outages also has the impact that because the NISO does go through this process and allocate all those monies, they notice when something isn't allocated. You know, you see there's a problem because you should be able to allocate all the money to an outage. And if there's something that's showing up, if we got shortfalls that don't have a cause, it says, okay, you dig into that. And actually the transmission owners see those settlement sheets, so they say, we want you to dig into that. We want you to figure out why we had this shortfall that isn't allocated to an outage of a transmission owner or an external transmission owner. So it provides a reinforcement. And in fact, the last bullet is the first thing that happened was this was implemented is they found out that what they thought was a shortfall problem in New York due to outages was not at all due to outages. It was due to a modeling error in the auction database that a 900 megawatt grandfathered TCC was not being modeled in the auction, so the system was overselling capacity in New York City by 900 megawatts in every auction. And that wasn't an outage, but it was something that immediately became apparent when you started tracking this. So that's another feature. Now this is MISO, and they're not as good an analogy because they don't sell the whole system, and they also do some buyback of infeasible FTRs in their monthly auctions, but still the shortfall is much smaller. And that's the comparison I'm setting up with CAISO. This is why I think CAISO is striking. You know, that's 69% funded compared to the NISO 89% with no outages modeled. So I just feel that we ought to understand why this is, and the presentation I gave last time was part of my effort to struggle with why this might be, that maybe it's that we have FTRs or CRRs being purchased in the auction that are magnifying the payouts, and therefore when you magnify the payouts, you magnify the shortfalls. Or maybe it's because of the lack of constraints being modeled, so things are being oversold and we're different than other ISOs. But I mean, I think this is, you know, a part of the picture here that there really is something that is different, it seems to me, about California in terms of the level of the outages. So the thought is that a good thing would be to try to understand why we have these shortfalls, and if it's due to the kind of CRRs we're selling, and maybe we're addressing it with the 1A reforms, and that it's associated with particular source and sink purchases, or maybe it's something else. But it'd be good to, you know, be able to implement a process where we could understand why we're getting these outages and not have to spend 6 months studying it like you had to put in and your team. But be able to rapidly diagnose things. So those are my thoughts, not directly on point to what we're talking about, but I thought they were relevant.
Several hands already. First here, then here.
Yeah, Doug Bochin-Yonam with Flynn Resource Consultants for Silicon Valley Power and City and County of San Francisco. On the slide with the NISO, I noticed that the amounts of the shortfall jumped around quite a bit, and it was quite high in the final year you had on there. And I'm just wondering, well, first, is your thinking that because the PTOs have this incentive to manage their outages, that they do a better job because they're going to get hit with the cost? But then if that's the case, you know, what accounts for the variation? Is it just, it was a bad year?
Well, there's still, you have there's still the things of, do you have outages during a summer with really high prices or not? And what's, you know, the cost of outages. Sometimes you have a mild year, things don't matter that much. So it's always going to vary, no matter how hard you try. There are going to be years where you're unlucky, and part of the focus also is in New York, the transmission owners are given enormous flexibility to schedule the outages when they want. And there's a whole section of the tariff you'll also see for quick hit outages, that if you see a streak, your weather forecast of cool weather, you take advantage of it, and you do the maintenance then. And the ISO, as long as it doesn't have reliability problems, they don't make you tell you 5 years in advance when you're going to do it. If you see a window and that's a good time to do it, you do it. But you may not see a good window. And some kinds of maintenance that comes up now and then takes longer and requires things be taken out. So, there's something there's no magic bullet. I didn't mean to suggesting this is going to reduce the cost of transmission maintenance to zero. I'm just saying at the margin, it can have a beneficial effect, and also understanding where these costs are coming from and why they're so large would have a beneficial effect. What is it? And I don't know. I don't have insight into what it is about California, and maybe it's perfectly intrinsic reasons about the nature of the grid.
And that gets to my follow-up on the final slide. So my understanding that your point isn't, go off and do these long studies. It's like set up some tools so you're continuously monitoring what's going on so that when something big happens, you can get on it right away.
Right. Whenever, have it set up so that on a routine basis, so without a lot of effort, you can sort of see when something's not right. And then when something doesn't look right, you can dig into it and sort of be focused into, actually one of the things with this data we did when we were digging into 1 month, we couldn't figure out where some of the shortfalls were coming. And we got all the hour-by-hour shortfalls we couldn't account for. And I ran a regression of those hourly shortfalls against the shadow prices of all the constraints in New York. And what do you know? The statistics had bumped out. Oh, it's somewhere in New York City, in this particular part of New York City where this is happening. And they went in and dug into the vendor's software, and he had one of those undocumented features that automatically set really low impedance lines to zero, saying, oh, it can't be that low impedance, it must be zero. Well, actually, in New York City, they're really, really, really low impedance lines. And when you set them to zero, that was not right. So that, once you have the data, you can start sorting through it and see what's causing it.
I think Ellen was next.
Hi, Ellen Wolf, Zero Consulting for WPTF. It seemed, my recollection from the ISO's analysis was that a lot of the revenue inadequacy was due to one of two things. One was TO outages that weren't scheduled or weren't incorporated into the models in time, and the other was these constraints that the ISO operators decided to invoke in the day ahead that also weren't modeled in the CR auction or allocation processes. But so Scott, my question was, this policy that New York has, it wouldn't, or what would it do with the operator-initiated outages that weren't driven by transmission owners? Does it have a different bucket for those kind of revenue?
Operators put in a constraint. I mean, it's still going to show up as the effect of the outage. And it's possible that these D ratings are so large they have these huge energy market impacts, or maybe they're bidding strategies for the kind of CRRs that are being purchased that inflate the magnitude of those outages. I don't know.
I mean, the one that comes to mind is cross-trip nomogram, which was a big deal a couple of years ago, and it wasn't one that the participants in the CR process could have anticipated because it happened after the CR processes were done. And I think it's more of a nomogram type, look and see if Guillermo's back there, nomogram type constraint. So I don't know that it would have been the fault, so to speak, of a transmission owner. So if we were to have this kind of policy in the CAISO, we would need different buckets of allocation, I imagine, some that are
No, I mean, when you take a line out of service, it has impacts on constraints, and you can compare the impact of having that outage or not having that outage on the level of congestion or shortfalls.
Yeah, adding a nomogram if the underlying lines haven't changed seems like it's clearly in a second category that's not the TO's response. Well, I guess you could argue. I'd have to know more about why the nomogram was, but I think the more maybe pressing context would be that, from my understanding, there's discussions about depowering certain lines that are near wildfire risk areas during periods of risks of wildfires as a preemptive measure to try to avoid them going forward. And that might look like an outage from sort of a typical, but that's more of sort of a strategic dispatch of a line, I think. And I'm not sure if that discussion is a distribution level or a transmission level sort of thing, but that would be an example that I think you would definitely want to sort of sort through as to whether that's the TO wouldn't necessarily be at fault for that, if it's a widely recognized sort of best practice for preventing
Yeah, and that's the thing in New York. If the operators derate Central East because of conditions, that doesn't get assigned to the TO. That's isolated too, that the operators derated Central East because of flows or something they were worried about. So you can isolate everything and figure out why it happened.
Thank you.
I think Perry was next.
Oh, yeah, you just made me think of something else. So earlier you mentioned that they have, in New York, they have, you said something to the effect of they see an open window to take an outage. Is that due to, or they notice low congestion on the system and then they kind of say, oh, I'm going to try to get my outage in right now, and okay, I'll pay for it if it causes.
Right, because they're going to have to pay for it. So do they want to wait and pay for it when maybe it heats up and the loads and it's congested? Or if they see a really benign forecast that it's going to be, 65 degrees for the next 12 days and absolutely nothing's happening, they say, well, that's the time to do it.
So they have the sophistication in place to know the impact that they're going to have on the system.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a time to get ready, but I guess, after a while you see the opportunity.
Okay, so they have the sophistication to know what the exact impact they're going to have on the system.
Well, I mean, they just have the sophistication to know that if they got a weather forecast that they know the load's going to be low for the next week, that's a good time to do it because there's not going to be any congestion.
Okay.
I want to understand the incentives. So let's say that they had scheduled well enough ahead of time that it was included in the FTR auction. They schedule an outage well enough ahead of time.
No, it's not included. The TOs, as a matter of policy, don't model them in the auction.
At all. Okay, so any outages. All right, so that does not give you an incentive then to stick with the present schedule. Okay, that's good. Okay, I think first.
Paul Gribbick, PG&E. I think the nomogram issue is particularly interesting because from what I've seen, the West relies a lot more on nomograms than the Eastern RTOs. For example, in MISO, I could only think of a couple nomograms in the entire area where you've got a ton of them out here. Instead, out there, they tend to rely more on modeling the transmission contingencies directly in the markets, which gives a better model. Out here, for example, I may look at some remedial action schemes, model it as a nomogram. If I assume my dispatch is going to be in a certain pattern and I lose something, I assume I'm going to drop these and move things around. That is very hard to model directly in a CRR auction. And I think that is likely affecting a lot of this. I'm very interested to see what's going to happen with the transmission constraint modeling changes that are coming up. For example, the generation contingency remedial action scheme. Those would be, while not perfectly modeled in a CRR auction, would be much better modeled, and we wouldn't be relying on the operator sitting there tweaking limits going into day ahead, which God knows how in hell that's going to affect the CRR. So I think there's a lot of other moving parts here which may help improve this. Just wanted to raise the issue.
Doug Boccignoni again. Did you look at how much of the shortfall in the other ISOs is due to counterflow versus prevailing flow CRRs? And the reason I'm asking is, in the ISO, at least the data I looked at for 2017, about 20% of the shortfall came from the counterflow CRRs, which means we're sort of the auction models overestimating the level of congestion that we're going to see in the real market. And, you mentioned that the PTOs are not not including outages in the auction model. And I wonder if maybe we can learn something from that.
Yeah, one of the things when I gave that presentation a couple months ago about the potential to buy CRRs that magnify the outage, it cuts both ways of You can buy CRRs if the outage is not modeled that become much more valuable in the days where the outage occurs. But conversely, I pointed out there's also a possibility of buying counterflow CRRs, as you suggest, that are very expensive in the auction, but then are not very valuable in real time when the outage occurs. And that there's potential both ways. And if you've looked at the data, that's great. That's what we ought to be doing to understand what's driving these high costs.
Just to be clear, I've only looked at the ISO data. I haven't looked at other ISOs, just CAISO.
Okay. Do we have anybody on the phone lines? No, nobody on the phone lines. Anybody else in the room? Yeah, Guillermo.
Hi, this is Guillermo. Just to give you some reference, because I don't know how many participants are aware of this information, but for a few years, the ISO has been diligently following what are the revenue deficiency causes, and we indeed post this information in the monthly performance report. We specifically have a section that associates the revenue deficiency levels per constraint. Internal to our processes, we have this validation done every single day, and we are actually moving that to be done even before publishing and completing the day-ahead market. So it's not a matter of visibility. We do have the visibility of what happened and why that deficiency is occurring. Is that no different to the story we have put in the report? Is the outages, the difference of constraints enforcing between the markets and so on, that by the time we are running the market, there is little to do at that point on time, given the fact that the auctions are already run.
All right, thank you. I think at this point, Jim, we'll put you up there. So Dr. Bushnell is going to summarize some issues and thoughts that we've been mulling over as we develop our opinion, which presently is scheduled to be posted and adopted next week.
Right. So yes, as Ben said, this is sort of meant to kind of walk through our thinking as of now and try to get some reactions, feedback. So starting at the beginning, just sort of so people get a sense of where we're coming from in our recommendations. We do interpret CRRs, and I was realizing these slides are going to pop between FTR and CRR, but I don't have TCC in here at least. So we really do sort of, this goes back to concerns over vertical integration, competitiveness with vertical control of networks, and the idea that either someone who's integrated into generation or retail and transmission, or even somebody who just has a large position in transmission, in a world in which you have physical transmission rights that could be physically withheld, that causes both efficiency and competitiveness problems, and the whole sort of exercise of trying to figure out how to get competitive wholesale electricity markets was really about trying to solve that problem, because it's really difficult to define physical transmission rights, and also very difficult to try to let people exercise their right to ship power from A to B, given how integrated everybody's usage is. So the whole development of the FTR CRR was to try to come up with a economic equivalent of this idea of being able to use a network for a specific transaction without having the ability to affect the capacity of the network or the utilization of the network. So it's meant to create a financial equivalent of ownership, which I just sort of characterized as toll-free usage, not of the whole network, but of a specific part of the network. And I'm setting aside the TAC issues for now, but so it's not literally toll-free in the sense that users are paying some for the capital costs and other things. All right, so with that as the background, we think of CRRs or FTRs as this financial analog to trying to solve this access question for not just California's market, but sort of the general idea of how wholesale markets in the United States should work. And that means that access, ISOs have open access in real time. You can bid in, and if your bid is competitive, you get to use the network. But that open access or this vertical concern means more than just daily real-time service. It means something more longer term than that. So it's more than just spot purchases. It means the ability to somehow reach forward contracting arrangements that you can have some ability to hedge those usage costs for. It also, I don't think we view open access as going so far as to sort of going beyond open access of being able to match even pairs that there's no actual physical source sink relationship that you could sort of map literally to a first degree to a physical transaction, though. And so we're basically echoing what I take to be the ISO's position on this of sort of, yes, it's more than just real time, but it's not necessarily allowing every possible combination of nodes you could think of being made available through some kind of forward transaction. All right, so with that as background, and then, this last point was really what I was trying to say in the market power discussion, that right now particularly, California is going through a lot of structural changes that are providing headwinds to forward energy contracting. And I do have concerns that this would be one more wind there that is not hitting at a fortuitous time. So anything that might further discourage forward trading at this point creates some worries on our part. And I think the discussion is just how much this increases our worries and how much it's worth providing. Yeah.
Michelle Keto from the Energy Division, but
yeah.
Why at a zero price? I mean, I get that you want to hedge, but hedging costs something. It shouldn't be costless.
All right, we'll get to that.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so, and again, this is sort of just anything that makes it harder to get access to hedging instruments creates that concern. Not to say it's not worth it. Yes, there's a little bit of concern, but we still think there's reasons to take steps. I think it's really a question of which steps we're. Okay, so the reason the papers people were writing in the 90s didn't quite sort of reach reality as well as maybe we'd hoped was that if you can match the actual feasibility of a network, you get this revenue adequacy condition. And that's really, you could think of as we're selling the capacity that's actually there. But the problem is networks are constantly changing. And so if you want to provide this forward access or some type of at least year ahead or multi-month hedging, you're going to have to face some trade-offs between what capacity do we really think we can sell and how much of it do we think we should make available, given that the capacity that's feasible on Monday may not be feasible. So there's many dimensions over which there are really trade-offs here. And I think it's necessary to try to work through what the values and costs of these trade-offs are. You could sell, essentially what this whole discussion comes down to is, do we want to sell more CRRs that are less quality hedges, or do we want to sell less CRRs that are higher quality hedges? And the length is another dimension of that. And then weighing against that is, okay, well, we could sell as many perfect hedge CRRs as we want, but somebody has to pay for that, and that's where the financing and the revenue inadequacy and the payments through upcharges and TAC come in. Like, how much is it reasonable to ask transmission ratepayers to provide these types of hedging services? So that's where this trade-off, kind of focusing in on just the quality-quantity trade-off. This proposal, this Phase 1B proposal, we sort of view in that light that right now we provide a very high-quality hedge. There's no revenue refund required based on ex-post revenue inadequacy. And, I think by a reasonable kind of interpretation of how CRRs are supposed to represent a form of ownership of the transmission network, that is going beyond sort of that definition of open access in the sense that you're selling actually more capacity than at least ex-post turned out to be feasible. Where more in transmission world is complicated, but in a revenue sense, you are selling more value of capacity than turned out to be feasible. And so that is basically moving into the world of having transmission ratepayers subsidize the hedging function by actually selling more capacity than was available. And, you know, in the opinion, our first opinion, and I think at the last meeting, we talked about how that the transmission ratepayers and the ISO as their representative is in a unique position to sell CRRs, because they are collecting congestion revenues, and they're the only ones who can then sell the rights to the future stream of those revenues and actually reduce their the volatility of their revenues. If I sold a CRR, I'd be taking on a bunch of risk. Where if the ISO and on behalf of transmission ratepayers does it, they are at some level reducing that risk. They might not care about it because they're a regulated LLC or something, but they are in a unique position to provide that. Now, when you're selling more CRRs that actually exist, though, that logic goes out the window. Then you're actually in the same position as a financial firm in terms of selling a CRR that's not actually backed by physical congestion revenue because it's not feasible ex post. So reducing those payments is really consistent with this idea of selling the available transmission capacity, but not more than it. And then the question sort of comes down to, all right, but what are the costs or implications of the current ISO proposal, which is many ISOs do have some form of refund of the revenue inadequacy in place, but this proposal is really clever in trying to identify specific constraints that are responsible for that shortfall. So at one level, it's really attractive for addressing potentially the auction revenue shortfall, but it raises this question about what is it that a CR is actually supposed to be providing insurance or hedges against. I always try to describe these things to economists who don't work on electricity because they first get really confused, but they often sort of see things in a light that I often miss. And the one response I got was sort of like, oh, is this like health insurance that's great except when you get sick? If you basically are, you know, hedging the congestion risk, but your hedge goes away if there's transmission lines out. And, you know, viewed in that light, okay, well, what exactly should the responsibility of hedging be? Should it be only against the nodal price fluctuations on the network as it exists at a given moment in time, or should it be something beyond that, where we're actually providing or trying to, you know, share the risk of outages in the network itself amongst users of the network and people who need to hedge those risks as well? And so that leads us to our concerns with the 1B proposal, that it basically falls on the former side of this, that it provides a hedge only on nodal price risks and sort of says, okay, hour by hour, this is the network as it is, and your CRR will cover the price differences for the network as it is, but we're going to recall the payments based on transmission that is not actually available in the hour of the market, but was available at least in the CRR model. And that does raise some concerns. Now, and again, they're concerns. There's a lot of appeal to this, but we just didn't feel at this time that we could really have a good sense about how much additional risk this kind of approach was going to introduce to the market. Because Scott presented some aggregate numbers about what the shortfall is. It's pretty big. It's 30%. And if you start distributing that or slicing that 30% up, where some are taking more, some CRRs are taking less, you could get some really large impacts on certain CRRs and minimal ones on others, without, you know, having a sense about what the potential magnitudes and potential volatility that might be. It's really hard to sort of give a judgment about that. But underlying all this is this sort of worry that if we're making these that there's the risk here that certain CRRs, or maybe because of the uncertainty, all CRRs may become much less valuable as hedges, because no one really knows how much of a rebate might be associated with any specific CRR. Now, with the proposal we'll present in a second, you can quantify that. It's maybe a big number, but it is something that you can at least get a sense of based on historical, of a worst case based on historical statistics. There's also, I guess going back to kind of the old original motivation of CRRs, that the idea is to try to take a financial incentive away from a transmission owner, and control of the transmission system is given to independent system operators. You could sort of walk through strange situations where if a TO knows that a certain party owns a specific CRR, they would be able to sort of trace the outage of a specific line to the payments of a specific other party, and that can start to introduce some of these vertical competitiveness concerns that ISOs were meant to try to defend against. So if this 1B proposal, and our understanding of it, is motivated, it's a question of which problem are we trying to solve and how many tools do we have to try to solve those problems. There are multiple problems here. One is the auction revenue shortfall. The other is a revenue inadequacy problem that is pretty substantial, and in dollar terms, larger than the auction revenue shortfall, or it's different in the sense of who's bearing the costs of it. A lot of the revenue inadequacy is being borne within the LSE community, but I think we do need to think about what the equity issues within the LSE community are as well. If you're a small LSE who happens to buy a CRR that's massively revenue inadequate, that's largely being subsidized by other LSEs with large load, for example. So I don't know if we want to focus specifically on LSEs versus non-LSEs in all of these discussions. And if we are motivated by the auction revenue shortfall, that's where we gravitate towards trying to solve that with tools that are more directly aimed at that auction revenue shortfall rather than at the revenue inadequacy problem, which there are maybe simpler ways of trying to deal with that. Okay, so that brings us to our state of thinking here, which is how we would tweak this if it's at all possible to do in the time frame we're talking about. So the first thing would be, we recognize that guaranteeing firm CRR payments is going beyond what you might reasonably call open access, and it may still be worth it, though. I mean, a system as a whole may decide that it's worth socializing the risk of all transmission outage and nodal price risk because of the other knock-on benefits it might provide. In a sense, we socialize transmission lines generically. Everybody pays a load-weighted share for the capacity cost of those lines, and with a sense that we all benefit from them in ways that are very hard to quantify. But I think there's very large and persuasive voices sort of arguing that this is going too far in terms of socializing other people's risks and hedging. So by reducing that payment, you are preventing that overselling of transmission capacity, but instead of assigning it to specific line outages, we would just try to do something more straightforward, like a pro rata allocation. And we hadn't gotten real far in the specifics of this, but for example, based on the revenue collected by a specific CRR. That would be maybe not trivially easy to predict. We do hope that the Phase 1A changes are going to reduce this revenue inadequacy problem, maybe significantly. But looking at the historic revenue inadequacy shortfalls, you can sort of get a sense about what the potential magnitudes of these types of rebates might look like. Whereas with the line-specific one, it's very hard to get a sense of how much uncertainty associates with that. Okay, so that's maybe the I don't want to say the most straightforward, but that's the one that's kind of a step that's consistent with everything the ISO is proposing with the change of how we allocate that revenue shortfall. The other things on this list are maybe more difficult to achieve in a 1B frame, I suspect the ISO would say. But we do think they are important, and particularly maybe substitutes for the idea of targeting specific constraints with the CRR clawbacks. To the extent that targeted is meant to try to deal with the auction revenue shortfall, other ways to try to deal with that shortfall would be to reduce the capacity being auctioned. Before I get to that, yes, there's also, Scott discussed quite a bit the idea of trying to share this revenue inadequacy shortfall between TOs and CRRs. We think there's merits to that idea. The details, as the discussion of Scott's slides sort of revealed, would need to be worked through and would be a phase 2 sort of thing. But I think it's worth exploring what that proportion might look like, how mechanically it might work, whether it's doable. And again, it's sort of TO ratepayers are paying for a share of these lines, and in a sense, when those lines go out, who should bear the responsibility for that? So some split of that, I think, would be worth exploring. In addition, on the CRR part itself, reducing the auction capacity, there hasn't been a chance to do a full kind of extreme quantitative analysis of where exactly a capacity cut might lead to a dramatic reduction in the inadequacy. But so we're just sort of throwing out a modest reduction for now as a way of trying to just take a step towards reducing what might be the auction revenue shortfall to, say, 70%. And it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a reduction in the allocation. Auction less capacity than the allocation because of the way the capacity is defined. And then the minimum sale price of the CRR auction is an idea that we have been talking about for a while and keeps coming back in our minds as a way of trying to sort of directly target the shortfall. Exactly how that would work, again, there are lots of ways to try to explore that. We sort of were thinking that some percentage of TAC is a way of trying to think about this, because back to the Michelle's comment that, well, do people deserve CRRs for free? Maybe they don't. And it's reasonable to say that access to a network, if we're defining it as CRRs, there should be some minimum cost associated with that. And we view the idea of a minimum sale price through the CRR as one sort of mechanism for trying to do that. I think there are multiple ways of trying to achieve that, but under the perception, which hasn't been sort of fully, I think, clarified, but there's certainly the possibility that there are we know there are a lot of CRRs selling for very low prices, and that at least a non-trivial amount of the revenue inadequacy or the auction revenue shortfall is also attributable to those. I think those are both fair to say. Exactly where we cut that, would require at least a little bit of quantitative, but I think adding a minimum sale price would definitely move towards reducing that auction revenue deficit, and may be a really substantial tool for trying to do that. I'll stop there and get reactions. I think there's ways to sort of interpret this in light of some of the other proposals, but we can get some feedback reactions. Okay, so I'll take the phone question first.
Yes, good afternoon. It's Mark Holman with Congress. Hi there.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. I first say, great presentations by both Dr. Harvey and yourself. I thought, a lot of good points in here. Agreed with most of your points right through slide 5. I think slide 6 is really where I wanted to focus a bit. I think the one that we struggle with the most is probably point 1, but I'll talk about points 2, 3, and 4 first. I think that point 2, in terms of sharing it between transmission owners and CRR holders, makes a lot of conceptual sense, but challenging. I know that with the CAISO grid, sometimes the D-rates on the CAISO grid are a result of lines going out of service on neighboring transmission systems that can impact the ATC on the CAISO grid. Also, of course, there are a lot of line outages that can occur after the CRRs are allocated in auction that really aren't avoidable. So I think conceptually makes a fair bit of sense, but maybe challenging in practice. I think that reducing the auction capacity, I understand the benefits of that, but I kind of see it as, really that's just a trade-off, as you described earlier, of really reducing forward open access. The less you sell, the less revenue inadequacy you're going to have, but also the less forward open access there's going to be to the transmission system. And then the minimum sale price is again, can help deal with those 0 or penny CRRs. Maybe it's 25 cents, maybe it's 10 cents, maybe it's 50 cents. I don't know what the right level is, but it still creates the kind of opportunity just at a different level, which kind of shifts me back to the first point where I think we disagree, and maybe just to share some perspective on the allocation to the CRR holders who actually hold the constraint that is being derated. We actually see that as more equitable and more efficient. The point one of allocating across all positive revenue CRRs is really another form of socialization. And if we ignore the minimum sale price for a moment, you're still going to have that opportunity for someone to look at a constraint and say, hey, I think that constraint's not very valuable in most circumstances, and maybe I can pick it up at zero or for a penny, and on the 10% chance, 20% chance, 40% chance it gets derated, I'm still going to be able to target that and make money because I'm only going to bear a portion of that derate, and the rest is going to be socialized, no longer to load, but to load and everyone who holds CRRs on other paths. I think the second point we would make on that is that when you derate CRRs volumetrically, or the paths that are actually across the constraint, that actually provides some predictability. Because if I buy a CRR for the year, or for the quarter, or for the month, and I know when I buy that CRR, hey, look back historically, 10% of the time or 20% of the time that line gets derated, or that constraint that I have a high shift factor to gets derated, and I know that going in, I can actually evaluate the risk. Whereas if I go in and I'm just going to get some kind of socialized cost, it's actually much harder to forecast and may impact the value of all CRRs in aggregate much more than being able to actually forecast and say, hey, if I buy an intertie CRR to a trading hub or an internal generator to a trading hub, and I know what constraints I'm against, I can kind of forecast what the likelihood is historically of that constraint being derated. And perhaps the third point may be the most important point, which is that when you have derates on particular constraints, the entity that holds the CRR as a hedge is actually often the entity flowing power, and somebody needs to flow less power. So often if I have let's say 100 megawatt CRR from an intertie to a trading hub or a generator to a trading hub, and my CRR gets derated by 50% because that line or a constraint with a high shift factor gets derated, there's a good chance I'm likely flowing less power, or efficiently should be flowing less power. So there's a nice correlation there that, hey, my CRR is going down, someone needs to relieve the constraint. Maybe there's an incentive now that I'm more exposed to the short-term market price. I may be reduced in the market solution, and you're actually getting the resources or the imports that you need to reduce their output when their CRR is going down. And then the final point I'd make on it is that, we have extensive experience, as many other market participants do, in the OAT framework. And in the OAT framework, transmission providers collect tens of millions, some of them actually hundreds of millions of dollars, selling physical OAT rights, where when that path is derated, the holders of those rights receive the derate. And because you're able to forecast that, hey, I've basically got a contingent right, I get the value of that path when that line's fully in service. If it's 50% derated or out of service, I lose that value. You're able to forecast it. Your power flows are going to go down during those periods anyways. It actually hasn't eroded the value, and we see substantial investment. So we do support the CAISO's Phase 1B proposal. We like a lot of what you said here, but we do think that allocating to the specific holders of the constraints will result in the most equitable and the most efficient CRR auction outcomes, and as well as activity in the day ahead in real-time markets.
Okay, thanks, Mark. We definitely had many of those same thoughts. And let me just ask, in particular, and so we didn't necessarily want to dismiss this option as an eventual option. I guess sort of go back to this point where we're trying to sort of figure out what to say as a bottom line, which was sort of like, could we write that this will be okay for CRR holders? We just, can't conclude that it would not significantly reduce the value of any individual and therefore all CRRs. So when you say that you feel like it's more predictable, would you feel that way for the next auction? Or would you like to see a little history of data before?
I think what I would say is just, we're active in procuring CRRs for many years, and prior to MRTU, the FTRs, and we're active in the physical world, and we feel quite confident that if we're buying a CRR and it's going to be derated pro rata based on, for an intertie or an intertie constraint 1-to-1 because the shift factor is 1 on a pro rata basis, or for an internal constraint that we have a high shift factor to, we know that our estimate might be incorrect, but at least we know that we can forecast, look at the historical derates on that path. It is actually much harder to say, I don't know all of the other constraints that might be derated. I don't want to have to forecast them, and I don't want to find out that I bought a 100-megawatt CRR. Maybe I'll use the Pacific DC. Pacific DC each year goes out for about 4 weeks for maintenance. I know that. Maybe it's going to be 5 weeks, maybe it's going to be 6 weeks, but I can factor that in when I have to wear the derate associated with the Pacific DC being derated out of service. But if I now might find that my CRRs are ineffective every hour, every day, because I'm getting some unpredictable, random, in my view, or where we sit, random allocation of derates or revenue and asset associated on other paths, I actually find that much harder to evaluate. And again, it comes back to some of those opportunities where you're going to have entities still getting benefits from buying CRRs where their CRR is derated. They're getting these big payouts on low-cost CRRs that are being socialized onto others. So I hope I answered your question, but I think this derate on the specific path actually, or the specific entities that hold those constraints, both allocated and auctioned, is actually a very attractive framework for both being equitable and being efficient.
Okay, so I guess one response I have is you can imagine two kind of extreme cases. One is maybe a financial speculator that is out there looking for a low-priced constraint and is able to buy a low-price constraint and get a large payment if there happens to be an outage on that. And it does seem like this proposal is kind of motivated by targeting that sort of thing. I guess we also can imagine, though, that there would be a small LSE that would maybe really rely on a specific constraint, and they are looking for an ability to hedge the risk of the availability of that transmission. And we don't really know of a clean way to differentiate who the buyer of that right is. That's sort of part of the spirit of the minimum bid was, the small LSE who really values that as a hedge would be willing to pay more for it, but because either the constraint's not well modeled or because there's not a lot of other interest in it, they're able to get it for a low price, but they still have a high value for it as a hedge. And I guess, we also sort of thought through this idea of, well, if the line's out, they're not actually, flowing power, but if they do have a contract that's of the form of, basically selling power at a specific place at a specific price, they are still on the hook for the nodal price at that destination. And if we're talking about something like a trading hub to a lap, that the contract is still going to have to satisfy their obligations, even if the specific transmission paths that were anticipated for doing it might not be available.
I really like the way you frame that, because I think that's a great framing of the situation, is that the solution that the CAISO is proposing does deal with, I think we both agree that it deals with the first bucket of the speculation CRR where the cost or the big payoff relative to cost is being socialized. Let's talk about the LSE, and I think it's not that different for a generator or a supplier. You stated that you did acknowledge that when the line goes out of service, they're not going to flow any power. When it's derated, they may flow less power. I think from our experience, what we've seen in the OAK framework is that once you institute this, not only do you need less of a hedge because you have less power flowing as a generator or supplier, and we understand load still needs to serve their load, so they some exposure, but you also find that entities start to contract and embed those contract provisions in once they recognize that. For example, it's common in the OAK framework that forward power contracts have provisions to equitably allocate the risks associated with derates through those forward contract provisions. And so we don't see that as particularly problematic. Now, having said that, there is no, I think you pointed on your earlier slides, there is no perfect solution. At the end of the day, selling forward transmission capacity and selling it in monthly and quarterly and yearly increments is necessary to provide forward open access to the transmission grid. If you do that, you're inevitably going to get changes to the transmission topology, both derates and changes, where you're going to get periods where you have revenue inadequacy. So then the question comes, if we accept that we want to sell it forward to provide efficient forward contracting, which the previous presentation, I think that point was also highlighted, then we have to say, well, who is in the best situation to bear that cost of derates, both from who should bear it from an equity perspective, but also who is most likely to be best situated to bear that. And we come back to and think it's the entities that hold the CRR, because both they're the ones who benefit from the derate, often from higher payouts. They're the ones who own the CRRs on that path, but whether they're a speculator or hedging, but also B, they're often going to reduce their power flows, and hopefully for grid efficiency purposes are often reducing their power flows through the CAISO dispatch, that they are the best situated to bear that reduction in transmission transfer capability, rather than socializing it across a broad group, which creates both the continued challenge we're seeing in the speculator first bucket, but also the second bucket, where it's going to be hard to forecast the value of CRRs if you're getting some kind of socialized cost of derates on other paths that you don't own, have nothing to do with. Again, I guess I would call it allocating it to the people who hold the CRRs on that path, of which we will, of course, experience our fair share of derates or deficiency allocation, we think is the lesser evil of all of them. And there is no perfect win here because it's just the nature of the transmission grid changing after the CRR auction has occurred.
Yeah, I guess my logic was if we think of transmission outages as at least partly random, that there's randomness to them, that the socializing or the pro rata spreads that risk out, and that to the extent it's easier to predict that we'll have a certain amount of outages and a certain amount of revenue shortfall in aggregate. That's what we can calculate now. You know, it's very difficult to try to calculate the inadequacy on a finer level, that it would be more predictable for now. All right, Michelle.
Thanks.
Yeah, just a couple of points. So in general, I just feel like the benefits of the competitive market should outweigh the costs. And here I feel like we have an instance where the cost and the benefit are kind of the opposite, and the people that they're allocated to are not exactly who I'd expect it to. So in this case, we have the cost going to load, and we have the benefits primarily going to speculators, as far as I can tell. So that seems problematic. The other thing is hedges shouldn't be costless, right? You actually shouldn't make money on hedges. It should actually cost you something to lock it in. So if we're trying to think of this as physical capacity, I'm trying to lock in the physical transmission capacity. That should cost me something. I shouldn't expect to make money doing that. And so I think that's the fundamental problem that I have. And I guess I'm sure I don't understand it at the level you guys do, but it just is not even making sort of the least bit of sense to me.
Well, I guess I would agree with it shouldn't necessarily cost nothing point. I guess our solution to that is a minimum sale price. That I don't think it's necessarily true that the hedge should never make money.
Well, hedges make money, but you're hedging something, and it usually isn't costless. If I want to lock in a price, I say I pay a premium, right? It's not like I actually, usually if I'm going to lock in prices for 2 years, no one pays me to do that.
And this is Brad Cooper. I'd add that, you know, that's what we were primarily addressing, and what we recently filed with FERC was to try and eliminate the CRRs that are going for no price by restricting it to delivery pairs. You know, this now is an additional measure to, you know, while the first phase worked on or is intended to work on the auction prices, now this is addressing the revenue insufficiency, which is on the payment side.
Yeah, Ellen?
Hi, Ellen Wolf for WPTF. I wanted to respond to some of the items that you are talking about on your proposal, but then also raise a couple others. I think, like Mark described, WPTF agrees that The parties that hold the CRRs are really the ones that can most efficiently value the risk of the allocation of the revenue inadequacy. So like Mark said, if I'm bidding on a CRR, I probably have more focused attention on what that risk is through the D rates, and I can factor that efficiently into my price. If you're going to socialize that, then you just have to kind of guess. And I think the discount that will be applied then to CRs will be much greater. And on net, then the CR prices will be less efficient than they would with direct assignment. And in WPTF, we have small LSCs too, which is kind of nice because then we get to balance both sides of it. And I'll actually reach out to them and see if they'll submit some comments back because they'll think about this more specifically. But I know one of the things that drives small LSCs crazy are socialized costs because they have a horrible time estimating what those costs are. So they go out and strike deals with customers, for example. I'm thinking about like ESPs, for example, and they think they know what their prices are going to be, and then they come back and get some socialized costs that they didn't have any real way of predicting. So I'll be surprised if they agree that they would prefer a socialized mechanism as opposed to a more directly assigned one. But we'll try to get you some feedback from them on that. A couple other qualities of this that you didn't address, and I don't know if you're planning on it or going to be silent on it, whether you have a socialized mechanism or one that's directly assigned, you still have to deal with these two parts of it that WPTF's had some heartburn with, and I know we've had some communications with you about this. One is this temporal element to allocating the cost. And the shorter you go on this, and especially in conjunction with if you're going to only allocate shortfalls but not also allocate surpluses, you have a tendency to over-assign then this penalty to the holders. So I don't know if you're going to comment on that or if you have a position now that you wish to talk about. The other quality of it that we've been concerned about is this issue that came out in the addendum, which is whether you treat counterflows symmetrically or not. You know, if we start treating counterflows different than predominant flows, then we start getting our CRRs out of whack, and people have to pay a lot of attention as to whether they sell a CRR or buy a reverse flow CRR and those kind of problems. So I don't know if you've given those thought now, but those issues are relevant whether you allocate in a socialized way or whether you allocate in a path-specific way or constraint-specific way.
So why don't we have thought about those, but I'll take Doug's question and then see if then we'll transition and try to get back to those specific elements. I guess I do take, at least the flavor of your comments in terms of the averaging over time as being a form of socializing or trying to make the change to the payments less specifically targeted and sharp. And I view what we're talking about here as sort of an extension of that, which I guess goes farther than what you'd wanted, but just seems like when you want to try to predict what happens to a CRR payment on a specific set of constraints, there's going to be a lot more volatility, a lot more uncertainty than when you're bundling together all of those random shocks into one aggregate average.
Yeah, I guess that just would raise the distinction because I think if there was symmetrical treatment to surpluses and shortfalls, then we wouldn't be suggesting to expand the time horizon. But when you sort of administratively apply this policy choice to only allocate shortfalls but not surpluses, then you create, in a way, an artificial distinction. And then the more finely you slice up the allocation, the more penalty you're going to give because of this choice to only to asymmetrically allocate. So I would be totally in agreement with you that it sounds like I'm advocating for socializing, but it's only driven by this quality of it where the ISO is proposing to only allocate half of the equation, only allocate the shortfalls. So you don't have the two to balance each other out. But I honor your choice to hold this discussion. I did have one more point about your proposal, or one more question, which is this floor issue. Because the question of a floor, I'm not really clear. I'd be interested in your thoughts on why, from an economist's perspective, that makes market efficiency, that there's a market efficiency argument behind it. And from a more pragmatic position, I'm concerned because some of these deals that people do have very, very small margins in them. And some of these delivery risks might be non-zero, but they may be still non-trivial when you add them up 87, 60 hours, for example. So how do you decide when to let somebody buy a hedge and not to let somebody buy a hedge? And then I also have a question about how does counterflow, how do negatively valued CRs work in that paradigm?
Okay, so I'll address the point about the minimum bid, and then I think we'll circle back on the sort of technical details about the. At least I view that as, we've heard from a lot of stakeholders about how they view this as a forced sale at zero, and I don't. Because of issues we talked about at the last meeting, there are types of CRRs that can't be created in the allocation process. There are sort of complicated interactions between regulators and regulated LSCs about exactly what the incentives and permissions are for trading CRRs that the willing sellers may not be able to sell because of all of these complications. And a minimum offer price is sort of a different proxy bid placed for the representative community of transmission ratepayers. That's not zero, but in the absence of being able to form kind of what we would think of as a free market set of offer prices or sale prices, it's in there sort of as a representation of that. Doug.
Hi, Doug Boccione. On the counterflow point that Ellen raised, I think maybe this will be a non-issue with the Track 1A because you'll be able to sell the CRRs. So it seems to me like if you've sold a CRR, you don't own it, somebody else does. So any counterflow that shows up would be like inadvertent, right? I mean, flows change. It's not like it is today where you get paid to buy a negatively valued CRR. Those are the counterflows, and I could see where there might be some discussion about the equity issues of whether it should be participate in the D rate. But if you've actually sold the CRR, you don't own it anymore. So there's nothing to be allocated to you. It's the holder gets allocated it.
Yeah, there's a couple levels on which this counterflow enters in, and yeah, the CAISO's addressed the issue you bring up of people need to be able to, to zero out the CRR they no longer hold. But there's also the issue of CRRs that may have a counterflow component, and it might create flows, over one constraint that's in the direction of congestion, but it might relieve another constraint. So there'd still be a counterflow component to it. Then that's one of the issues with the constraint by constraint. People pointed out a number of anomalies that, if you have if you start prorating back the counterflow payment, you could have a CRR that's negative, but you prorate back the negatives and it turns into a positive. Or conversely, suppose you have a positive CRR, but it creates counterflow over one other constraint. If you prorate back the part that has the positive value and leave the person with the negative value, you could have an LSC that thought it had a hedge and ends up being asked for money. And that wouldn't happen if you think back to the analogy of firm transmission service. Even if, Mark Holman's example, they curtailed your firm transmission service, they never say, oh no, you owe me for the counterflow that you didn't provide. It'd be they had to curtail your firm transmission service. And this is one of the things that Jim mentioned that we're just nervous about, saying this is going to work fine when there haven't been any simulations run of how often these weird situations are going to come up. And and that's why you said, well, maybe this is a good idea, but it hasn't been tried, and we start thinking about some of these anomalous situations, and we're not sure if that's just, never going to happen, or if we're going to run it the first month and, 30 LSCs are going to be upset because they got, weird things happen that were not what anybody talked about being part of the deal. And I guess another thing about, the counterflow treatment, under 1A, a lot of the purely counterflow FDRs are probably not going to be bought and sold anymore. So the treatment of them is going to be less important because there's probably not going to be a market, except for, counterflows from the tie to the hub and from the hub to the tie. I don't think there's much else that's going to be in the market.
That was my main point. I think it's maybe going to be less of an issue than it would have been now. The other point I want to make is it relates to the allocating pro rata. I think you're suggesting pro rata based on value. I mean, in terms of what revenues were collected. No?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess my concern with that, because it's not linked to the bid-in value, is that, so let's say you had a CRR that sold for 10 cents, something above this, some threshold, and let's say it collects 20, and because of some outages, and there was inadequacy on that constraint. Well, you have some other CRR that sold for $10, and it had $10.10 of revenues. They're going to pay whatever that is, 99 or more than 90, close to all of it. And it just doesn't seem right. It seems like whereas, I think Perry mentioned a couple meetings ago this idea about linking it to what the bid-in value, and you sort of go inversely proportional to the bid-in value, you allocate the shortfalls. And to me, that makes a lot more sense. And if you'd have to value the allocated CRRs highest because they actually paid the highest price, right? They paid the TAC, which is many, 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 many multiples of what any CRR ever clears at, especially when you factor in that you don't get CRRs for all your load. So anyway, that's related to that part of the allocation. The other thing is you made a comment about small LSEs and concerns about how they participate. In the auction, not the allocation, but the auction, most LSEs sell far more CRRs than they buy. Hardly any buy more than they sell. There's only a few that buy more. And the one who buys kind of about the same amount that they sell is buying big quantities. I wouldn't call them small by any stretch of the imagination. So I think, maybe I'm only talking about auction, so it's, you have to think about, well, what about the allocation? But, you're voluntarily choosing to participate. I think you can anticipate some of these, based on historical derates. And it just seems like the spreading it to everybody it feels a little uncomfortable from that standpoint.
So just on that last point, the ISO's proposal does apply to allocated as well as auction CRRs.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how not selling it in the auction reduces the risk.
That's fair. I'm just thinking about some of these issues where it's, and maybe I'm hoping for more of an allocation based on this inverse proportionality to the bid-in value. But and I've spent a lot more time looking at the auction and how people participate in it. I guess the other thing, tying back to one of your earliest slides about the sort of the open access arguments, I think we just have to be very careful here because 90% of the CRRs that were auctioned last year were held by people that transacted 4% of the energy in the ISO. 4% held 90% of all CRRs. 72% of the CRRs were held by people who transacted 0% of the energy. So we're talking about the 28% and the 10% of people who are actually like using transmission, physically injecting and withdrawing transmission. The rest of it is just financial. It's just, there's no transmission that they're trying to access. So I think we have to be careful when we think about why do we have these instruments, and when we say, well, it's linked to having open access to the transmission, if most of them are being used by people who aren't using any transmission.
This is Brad Cooper. Can I just ask a clarifying question? Doug, I didn't really understand your point about under the MSC's proposal to allocate the shortfall on a pro rata basis, because there could be a way to do it where when you're allocating pro rata based on dollars, that maybe I didn't understand your comment, that the CRRs with lower dollar value, they would have they would get a lower percentage of the, or everyone, they would get a dollar allocation to them, commensurate with the size of their CRRs. So I'm not following the inequity.
Well, because I'm thinking about, if somebody paid $10 for a CRR and makes 10 cents, somebody else paid a penny and makes 10 cents. The guy who paid $10 is going to get hammered, but he paid $10. He was only responsible for a loss of 10 cents. And I think when we look at, where do the shortfalls come from, and I really appreciated the slide that talked about, the real issue is the revenue shortfalls. We have a revenue inadequacy issue, which is sort of separate. And when you think about the shortfalls, when you look at where the shortfalls are coming from, and hopefully 1A is going to fix a lot of this, but I fear that there's still going to be residual problems. There's a handful of entities who are making lots and lots of money who aren't trading any energy in the ISO markets. They're CRR auction traders. And I'm having a hard time seeing where that's adding any value to anybody except the owners of those companies.
So just to make sure I understand your proposal, Doug, which would be then prorate the difference between the payout and the price in the auction for the same CRR. So the CRR that's sold for $10 and realized $10.10, you would then prorate the 10-cent difference.
Well, there's different ways to try to do this. You could do it.
Is that what you meant, though?
I mean, that's one idea. I think that what Perry had floated a couple of meetings ago was a little more straightforward. I think it would be simpler, which is just do it based on the bid-in value, where you assign a value for the allocations above the highest bid-in. I mean, I'd assign it based on the implied value of the access charge, but you could do the difference. I think you get kind of similar results.
I'm not sure I'm following this, Doug. It seems to me what you're proposing, if we allocated the shortfall based on the price, and someone paid $10 for it and it paid out 10 cents, if the shortfall was allocated based on the 10 cents, you'd only get like a penny. If we allocate it based on the $10, you might get $9. It seems like it's the other way around, that we don't want to allocate it based on if we're allocating the shortfall, we don't want to allocate the shortfall in proportion to what they thought it was going to be worth. If it turns out it was
I'm sorry, inverse proportion.
Okay.
Inversely. So the one that the shortfall is the greatest, either doing it relative to what you paid, or what Perry had originally said, which was, I think, inversely proportional to the bid. So the lowest valued ones end up paying the highest amount. And I think this is where you get into these concerns about, well, if someone had a CRR that was expected to be worth very little. But I think in the way I've in my construct of it, the allocation CRRs have the absolutely highest value. Because the cost to get an allocation CRR is you have to pay the TAC. And the TAC is so much more than the value of any CRR.
You only pay in the hours you use it. Remember, the CRR, you pay for all the hours. So it's not that.
Yeah, but I think if you look at how proportionally, it's much higher than what anyone ever pays for a CRR.
So this is Perry. I just want to make sure I understand the pro rata that you're suggesting on slide 6, because now I'm confused. Is it that it would be pro rata to the price paid or to the revenues paid to the CRRs at the end of the hour or end of the day? Those all pro rata to each other? Because there was this talk about, okay, another way would be to go pro rata to the profit of the CRR profit, I guess. That was the discussion I heard bouncing here. So which one is this?
Well, we were suggesting what we thought was the least complicated way of trying to do this, at least for 1B, which was pro rata based on congestion revenue payouts.
So in Doug's example would be the $10.10.
Yeah, and I can see Doug's example, sort of
the guy that only profited 10 cents is going to get hit with 99% of the shortfall.
No, in Doug's example, both paid the same sort of clawback, but one guy lost a lot of money in the auction because he paid a lot more than it turned out to be worth, and the other bought it for zero. And so it comes back to, are we trying to solve the auction revenue problem with this revenue inadequacy clawback, or are we trying to just sort of deal with the revenue inadequacy as a sort of separate issue relative to the auction revenue shortfall? And I think for me, it's trying to sort of separate out the people who really need a potentially very volatile CRR that could and are unable to absorb the sort of risks associated with that versus the speculator who actually is just trying to gamble on a payout. And maybe the bid-in value is a way to get at that, but the problem is then each CRR is different, and because each carries a different clawback ratio with it, and we worry about sort of what the knock-on effects of that might look like.
But I think the important thing is today they are different. The CRRs that are held by LSEs are worth less, and people who don't hold any CRRs are subsidizing the auction CRRs. Because right now, today, the auction CRR pays zero of the shortfall. Under the current design.
Of the revenue inadequacy shortfall.
Yeah, of the revenue inadequacy. And it's just...
Yeah, I think you have that. On a previous slide here, you mentioned it significantly...
But I guess you're equating low TO paying with CRR owning, and to the extent that the shortfalls are different across different allocated CRRs. I get your sort of point at one level, but I think it's not fully accurate at...
Can we have that?
Operator, can we take the call on the phone?
Operator?
The line has been unmuted. Caller, please go ahead.
Caller, if you're on mute, we're not hearing you.
We hear some mumbling, but we don't hear anything else. Caller, I'm sorry that we can't take your question right now, but could be. Operator, I guess we'll pass on questions at this time if we're not able to link up. Pardon me? Okay. At this point, we're running over. We can extend the meeting a little while. The last item is supposed to take, let's see, a full hour. I don't know if we'll need that full hour. Amber, but Amber, I'm sorry to have delayed things so long, but this is the getting the flexible ramping product working correctly and improving forecasts, important topic. So I'd like to introduce Amber Motley, who will be making a presentation on this, the last agenda item.
Move it down. All right, we'll see how fast we can go through this presentation deck. Is there somebody after me just for a time check? I'm it. So I'm the last one before you guys leaving to go home. All right. So I put a presentation together to come to the MSC to talk about the flexible ramp product requirements and then a little bit on the load forecast discussion as well. Some of the slides that are in the outline for the flexible ramp product update had been communicated in MPPF as well. But we're going to walk through them in this setting to give everybody an update of those changes, as well as talking about the persistent market model that went in place for the renewable forecasts. And then a little bit on load forecasting for market forecast versus what raw ELS is, and ELS stands for Automated Load Forecast System. It's really just a term for our load forecast model that exists on the short term. So going to the flexible ramp requirement update, we found, starting earlier this year, some issues with the implementation of a flexible ramp product requirement, and we summarized the changes that have gone through the requirement calculation since then. Item 1 was really the one that had the most significant impact, so I'm going to spend the most time in this presentation talking about that particular item. So prior to 221, the BAR tool was calculating uncertainty requirement, and I'll go into a different slide that explains it a little bit better than just B2A2 instead of B2A1. And that calculation, so instead of using B2A1, it was using B2A2. And that fix was deployed on 220 for operating date 221. So if you look at the calculation of what was expected, you can see that when you're looking at two different RTD runs, we're really looking at the uncertainty calculation right here. It was implemented doing B2A2, so it was implemented looking at it this direction instead of looking at uncertainty across the two different RTD market runs. So this is just further describing the change that was there. When you get into the impacts, you can see, so this was an example of January 23rd as we were going through fixing the B2A2 to B2A1. And when you look at that, you can see this is what the flexible ramp requirements looked like prior to the fix, as well as the distribution, looking at a box plot for the 95th confidence interval and kind of where distributions were lying. This is a typical pattern that was seen. Following the fix, you're seeing the distribution change throughout the intervals. Some intervals stayed very similar and consistent, but your distribution on your 95th% confidence interval did end up changing as well. So this was the biggest change that we saw when we were going through the implementation fixes in the last few months. The next item that was found was that the BAR tool was using a starting interval instead of an ending interval for the calculation of renewables. and that fix was deployed on 3/22 for operating date 3/22. We really didn't see significant changes in the requirement values from that change. Item number 3 is the treatment of the R2PD time frames in the uncertainty calculation, if you're averaging them versus you're not averaging them. This wasn't a complete error because the BRS described this as the potential no averaging, but when we dug into the details further, you are using an average for load side, so it's appropriate that you use an average on the renewable side as well for the 3 5-minute intervals. So we put a change in on 3/30 of 2018 for operating date 3/31, where the renewables are going to be averaging the 3 5-minute intervals, similar to what the load is doing, and averaging the 3 5-minute intervals. And lastly, thresholds, and we have an FRP requirement threshold documentation that went into 2 different business practice manuals. You had an update, 1051 and 1053 in the PRRs. One went into the energy imbalance market to go into details of how we calculate those thresholds, and thresholds can also be known as a kind of a cap that exists within the requirements as those resources are onboarding. And then the next one that went in was in the market operations section to talk in further detail about how we calculate those thresholds or caps throughout the entities in the area. So 1051 really is talking that when a new entity is coming on, you don't have production quality data during that period of time. So we are calculating a threshold requirement that is different than the typical threshold requirements, which is the 98th percentile right now, looking at a longer period of time around the last 60 days. And that can change based off of, with minimum it changes every quarter, but it can change based off of weather conditions. So you know that when you're running in the spring system, there's a lot of variability on the renewables that does impact into the requirements. So when we get into summer, we relook at the thresholds after we've had a little bit of heat in May, June, and do adjustments accordingly, potentially not following the quarterly cycle, so it could be more than that as well. But for the EIM entities, we are waiting for 40 days of production quality data, and then they will end up going to the detail that's described within PRR 1053. At this time, we didn't have any comments to either one of these PRRs, so they're moving through the process. Are there any questions on flex ramp requirements?
Sure. Yeah, if we could go back to slide, let's see, I can't read the slide numbers. Slide 8. So there's been this change, and now there have been published, I guess, in the Market Performance Planning Forum, 4 months more of prices, and I'm just wondering, has this obviously changed prices for FRP, or is it hard to tell? I actually had a hard time looking at the graphs of FRP prices and seeing a trend, but.
So I'll pass that one off to Guillermo. I look more at the requirements and the requirement formulation, not as much on the price.
Yeah, well, this is material that we're going to present next Monday on the NPPF, and we have some slides that show trends before and after. And I can tell you generally there is no conclusive change of pattern that we can observe. And one of the elements that may more difficult to decipher if there is an explicit change in behavior is the timing of the changes. This coincides basically with the time of the transitional months of between winter and spring, so it's evolving over time, and right. That introduces a lot of noise to be able to dissect how much is because of the seasonal trend versus the specific changes. In terms of prices, we saw some prices going up for flexible ramp. There are some costs that actually come down in terms of the settlement, so it's not conclusive at this point.
it hasn't made a dramatic, the changing of the constraints hasn't resulted in more shortages of it or more excess. It did look like that Arizona Public Service, compared to a year ago, they're paying much more. But the other hand, the EIM area is paying a lot less. And I wasn't sure what they meant by the EIM area in the bar charts of FRP payments. Do you know what this is, again, in the Market Performance and Planning Forum bar charts?
We are ready to post the information, and I think it would be better to have that discussion once we have that material out. And as I told you, there are several factors that are coinciding in timing for these changes. We have the change for the FRP requirements. We have changes for the expansion of the EIM. Now you have 2 more EIM entities. We have changes for the persistency model. That is the next topic that Amber is going to cover. So you have all this confluence of factors playing in around the same time. And it's almost impossible to dissect how much belongs to a specific fix of the FRP versus the other factors.
In my looking at the data, it seems to me that the shadow price of RTD FlexiRamp has stayed 0 again after this change. There's almost no impact. And I think that's probably because the dominant factor was probably not, may not have been these forecast errors, but the locational element that we're still procuring in a bunch of ramp where it isn't useful. So there's more to be fixed, I think.
So the zero shadow prices have been in the California ISO footprint. There have been non-zero ones elsewhere. Okay.
Thank you. No problem. All right, so to talk a little bit about the persistent market methodology update. So we started investigating a few years ago how we could better improve some of the forecasts that were in the RTD timeframe in specific. So it's known on the forecasting side that using telemetry or actual information or state estimator data in the forecast is really the best practice for forecast accuracy when you're looking within that 30-minute time window. Research papers have been out there. So at this time, with the numerical weather prediction models updating at larger granularities, you are getting some models that are updating quicker. You have the HRRR out there, the high resolution rapid refresh, that's updating a little bit faster. As more of those numerical weather prediction models come out, this may change. But for right now, we know that using actual information to inform the forecast in that 30-minute window is the most and best known practice. And so when we looked at using our external vendor, so our external vendor in this slide deck, we have a lot of acronyms on here just to try to make it small and big all at the same time. So FSP is Forecast Service Provider, and that's our external forecast service provider that's providing a forecast to the ISO for their renewable resources. So right now what we do is we collect telemetry information in a 5-minute interval, and then we send that information to the forecast service provider. They have to run their algorithm to produce a forecast off of it, then they need to send it back to us. After they send it back to us, you're really at this point in time on forecast to ELS, and ELS again is it says load forecast system, but it's the same system as the renewable forecast flow through as well. And there's some processing time in between there, so for those 3 minutes of processing time within ELS, and then you're hitting to send the data to the market, where the market is always 7.5 minutes out. So looking at this, we saw that there was a lot of, just by sending that data, them calculating it and sending it back, there was a lot of processing time that we could make improvements on. So we decided to in-house bring RTD intervals, binding and advisory only, into the market system to produce a forecast using some persistent type methods. Right now, the persistent method is using state estimator data in the market optimization, because the state estimator data is used for all the other market optimization pieces. So I want to make that clarifying point. And we have seen, so now we've reduced the time frame, so we collect an instantaneous data point at 1356, for example, and then at that point in time it runs in the market, and we see about 8-9 minutes of time lag instead of 20-30 minutes of time lag that we've seen previously. what does that do? So that it really has impacted the processing time for wind. So in this example, on the bottom, you can see, and it's a little hard to see in the chart, so red is actuals. External forecast is this purple line. I'll kind of point it out here. And then persistence is this light blue line. So you're really seeing that during the ramps in specific, you are really improving the accuracy looking at the actual information. And in this chart, actual is state estimator data because that's what the persistent model is running off of in the market optimization. So we have seen gains, especially during the ramps for those periods of time. We have a different type of methodology, still a persistent type methodology, but solar, because it has a predominant ramp feature on the up and down when sunrise and sunset happens every day, you really need to collect data on a daily basis for each individual solar resource. So every solar resource we have has what we call a reference curve, and that reference curve is showing the full output of what that resource capability would be on that day based off the sunrise and sunset and sun angle that occurs. And it updates and changes over time. And that allows us to use what we're calling, it's a contour persistent model. And we also see benefits in using that model. You can see some of them are a little harder to see because this is a sunny day, but on the partly cloudy days or cloudy days, this is more, you can see this more exacerbated. But in this particular area right here, this purple line is the external provider, the red line's actuals, and then persistence is sitting between. See that it is just that time difference is really impacting some of those intervals. One of the complications that took a while to implement on the supplemental, on the persistent method is supplemental dispatches. We knew that we had to account for them to ensure, some people know it as the death spiral, but essentially we want to ensure that the forecast is not always trending down if you're trending off of actuals. We have supplemental dispatch in this example. During the time of supplemental dispatch, we are defaulting back away from the persistent model to the more weather-based model so that you can get the full output of the resource and ensure that the market optimization is seeing that full output before dispatching the resource down. There are some enhancements that we're expecting that are going to come from the methodology. We're running a more in-depth analysis right now on the persistent method since it's been in place for a little over a month now. And based off that, there's some recommendations that we're going to make to even improve the supplemental dispatch handling a little bit more. But even with supplemental dispatch, what we want to see is this is at a CAISO total level. The actuals are sitting here, the supplemental dispatch is on the bottom, so you can kind of see that it's mirroring the shape of the supplemental dispatch, but you can see that the persistent method during this period of time is going back to the higher level and not following this down and degrading the forecast quality. So that's what we want to see. You can see, and I'll point out, is there are some oscillations that are happening here because you are switching back and forth on methodologies, and that's what we're going to work to improve in future up the method. Yeah, sure. So supplemental dispatch, so when a resource submits a bid and they're wanting, say, I'll dispatch for a certain price, but once you get to zero, dispatch me down. I don't want to be dispatched on. So supplemental dispatch is essentially the market optimization, moving that resource for characteristics that are related to market optimization. So the price has told them to go down, or there's a curtailment in that area on a different local level, and they're moving for those types of reasons, and then a supplemental dispatch number.
It's an instruction over and above a forecast for a variable resource. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
That's a great way to say it, too. So looking at one day, this is a wind resource, and we have an individual resource on the left side and a system comparison on the right side. And we are using MAPE, so mean absolute percent error. You can see we expected about a 50% improvement in the persistent methodology from what we had before, and you can see that on an individual resource level here that you're at about 50%, and you see some significant improvements. There are some time periods that aren't as improved, but really during when it's ramping, you do see those improved characteristics on the wind. For solar, an individual resource, again, you are seeing improvement. We are seeing improvement on the ramps, but on the system side, the biggest gain is for that ramp. So that morning ramp and that evening ramp, that's where we're seeing a lot of the gain. This day in particular was an April day that we chose for this slide, and there were supplemental dispatches happening as well. So that will, at that point in time, you're defaulting to the weather-based forecast, so the improvements wouldn't be quite as substantial as if you were just running on persistence for the whole day. Any questions on the persistent methodology? All right. So looking at the market forecast, so a little bit of background, what is the market forecast versus an ALPS forecast? There's a current role right now that exists within the CAISO operation function where they're updating the load forecast for the market optimization. So ALPS, the load forecasting system, runs every 5 minutes. It produces an updated forecast every 5 minutes. The floor has the ability to push and publish forecasts downstream every 5 minutes, every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, 40 minutes, in what they see is needed for the forecast updates. That functionality has been on the operations side for CAISO for a number of years at this point in time. And it really is there because they found that when they're dealing with an ACE excursion or an operational reliability item and a load forecast went in and really moved the system during that period of time, it could really affect their ability to recover their ACE or end up controlling that reliability situation. So they wanted to have more insight into the updates that were coming on the load forecast side to ensure reliability for the system. So in this presentation, we're going to look at the difference of the pure raw ALPS, so automated load forecast system updates, versus what the market ran with for RTD and RTPD. And the data that we used for the analysis was January 1st of 2017 through April 30th of 2018.
Sorry, just for clarification, is the raw ELF the one that you guys are generating now internally, in-house, versus what you actually saw in the market? Is that what you're going to?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Thanks. Perfect.
Can we make sure if you ask a question to state your name and the affiliation? Thanks.
So these are a little hard to see, but the overall trend, so there's two graphs on here. So you have the RTD, so this is MAPE, so again, mean absolute percent error, comparison by hour in the error sense, and then we also have it on megawatts on this scale. And even for me, I know from seeing the presentation earlier that this is around 200 megawatts. This is 250, this is 300 megawatts. So you are seeing in RTD, there's two different lines on the bottom. So you have T minus 10 minutes and T minus 15 minutes. And when you look into those, on the forecasting sense, we always look at when was that forecast generated versus the actual period of time. So that's 10 minutes prior. That corresponds closely with the RTD market run, picking that forecast up about 7.5 minutes out. And then 15 minutes would be the forecast 5 minutes prior to that 10-minute interval. And you can see that the red line during these periods, the T15 is around this area, and the T10 is down here, and you have the market forecast in this range. So there's about 200 megawatts of error around this period, and then there's about 100 megawatts of error when you're looking at the ALPS model. Overall, if you just look at the error pieces, you are seeing a benefit in using the ALPS system, automated generated forecast for the RTD intervals.
Amber? Brad Cooper, so is the market used, that's after any load forecast adjustment, right?
This doesn't include biases.
It doesn't include.
No, there's no bias. I do have a slide a little bit later in the deck that shows the load conformance or the bias that's associated, but this is the forecast that was used with no bias.
How does what the market used get changed from what else produces?
So in this sense, it's just showing that and I'll get to one more slide, this slide, and I think I can answer that question. But I know I have one more question before that. But if I don't answer it on this slide, ping me one more time.
The market uses what was in RTD, and that came from some period prior. Could have been 30 minutes before or 40 minutes before, is that it?
Right.
And then you're comparing it to what came out of ELSE, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, how about 5 minutes? What do we...
So the market wouldn't be able to pick up the 5 minute prior because it's running at every 7.5. So the closest that we could get to it would be 7.5 minutes out, which is why we choose in the analysis point to take about 10.
Okay, that's prior to the real-time interval, not prior to when RTD.
Exactly, yes, that's prior to the real-time interval.
Okay.
So to answer Brett's question, so one of the things that we wanted to look at is the time evolution to say, you know, what is driving those differences in the market used forecast versus the ELSE raw forecast. So on this far left side, you can see this is the accuracy. So again, we're looking at MAPE, so mean absolute percent error of the market. And then on the bottom axis, and these are all the different colors are all months, you're going through time of, you know, T minus 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20, all the way out to T95. So essentially looking at the forecast evolution based on time. So you can see, if you look at this line, since it's nicely sitting on 0.8, that if you go over and down, you're about equivalent to a T minus 55 forecast. So this insinuates that based on this, that we're seeing that those accuracies are coming from an update potentially happening about every hour, every 50 minutes. Go ahead.
Walter from AC. Can you go to the previous slide? So can you explain why the market forecasts are always higher than the two comparison you have, like minus 10 or 15? I cannot see.
Right. So I think it's going back to this slide. So the market used forecast at this point in time is showing that it has more error than the ELSE forecast that's updated 10 minutes prior and 15 minutes prior. So
right, why is it always a positive error? Should it be?
These are not, so there is no positive, negative in this. So this is an absolute error on that side, so it's not always positive or negative.
Okay.
And this is MAPE on this side. So just error percentage. So it's irregardless of a bias on one side or the other.
Just to add this is the metric based on accuracy, that is basically an error, it's an absolute value. There are indeed deltas positive and negatives, and actually you have some slides in the appendix that shows the frequency, the duration of those errors, and you can see they are in both sides, positive and negatives.
Yeah, and if we have time, we can get to them. There's some box plots in the appendix of this.
I didn't understand why you said that on this one, why it's better after an hour. It looks like it gets steadily worse, that we should be using the most current forecast, and just gets worse and worse and worse as time goes on.
Right. So our conclusion, just looking at these slides so far, is that the ELSE forecast raw coming out is better than what has been used in the market system. Okay. But I want to caveat that because there's a few slides to come that's going to look at load conformance that says that maybe it's not really impacting the market that much. So in RTPD, you see similar trends, but not quite as significant as you're seeing in RTD. So you're seeing that there's some periods of time that this is error on this slide and this is megawatts on this side, that you're seeing some periods of time where market is green, that the accuracy is worse for the market used. But you are actually seeing that there are some periods of time that the ELSE, the automated load forecast system by hour, has some intervals that are creating the overall error for the market to be less during the turns that occur. Sorry, I got distracted. So that is something that we're seeing, but really overall, compared to RTD, you are seeing that the accuracy in the RTD time frame for the market versus ELF, there's some gains and there's some areas where even the market forecast could get better, especially when you're talking about the morning turns. Same evolution, as we talked about before. Looking at the market side, you can see in this period that you're about 45 minutes. So the accuracy of the market to the accuracy of ELFs is about 45 minutes out. This is all averaged in a day, right? So you get more granular. You see what hours are helping get where on this graph on the previous slide. So looking at load conformance, and Guillermo mentioned this earlier with some questions as well, is we wanted to break it out into looking at load conformance during different periods of time. So you're seeing that this is the load conformance prior to any FRP changes, is blue. The load conformance following FRP changes is orange. And then the load conformance following FRP and the persistency model going into place is gray. And really what we're seeing is that we don't see a meaningful difference in the load conformance patterns at this time, but a lot of that is difficult to see too because you're looking at three very different periods of time. So prior to changes, you're in the winter months, 11, November, December, January, then you went into February and March, and then you put persistence in, you were in the late spring. So we really don't have a very constant, at this point in time, data source to be able to see what it's really doing for load conformance.
Could you explain what this is? What do you mean by load conformance? What are the numbers that are going into that?
So this is the bias numbers that are in the market.
So this is the...
How is it changing? There's a number that's being used now. Doesn't make a difference. How do you, what are we doing, what are we comparing? I mean, load conformance is just a single number to what they put in.
Right, so we're comparing the different time periods over time and then the megawatts. So this over on this side is a megawatt number. So you're seeing that this is 400 megawatts during hour ending 7, so they've been conforming over a period of time, 400 megawatts. Even after those changes, they're still conforming during that specific period around.
After those changes, what changes do you do?
So one change to the orange line is when the FRP changes that we talked about previously went in, and then the gray line is the persistent method that went in. So the changes are the two different fixes that we've talked about previously, and just trying to see if anything has changed in load conformance or bias behavior.
I was wondering if maybe the load conformance is happening because we're using the wrong load forecast. I would be interested to see if, the operators are compensating for the fact that we've got a load forecast that's 40 minutes or 50 minutes old, so that we'd see that if we flowed through the right load forecast, they wouldn't have been doing some of this.
Yeah, and I think Amber is going to elaborate on this metric. We try to capture that correlation. We know the load conformance is a catch-all blunt instrument for any imbalance the operators observe, potentially including the mismatch created by not updating timely the forecast that is coming from the forecasting application. What this plot is going to show you is that about 70% of the time, the conformance basically is in the same direction of the delta introduced by not updating the forecast. That means the forecast, the load conformance in 70% of the time is not to offset that delay of the forecast update. It's actually in the same direction. That means if load forecast conformance was the only, if the load delay was the only reason why the operators are conforming, actually not having this delay would require higher conformance in 70% of the instances. This shows that there is no very strong correlation one way or the other. One is RTP, the other is RTD. In 70% of the cases, again, the conformance is actually in the same direction of the delta. It's actually on top of the latency. Otherwise, the conformance would be even higher if that was the only reason why they are conforming.
So as Guillermo was walking through this is the graph that he's talking about to really show the conformance. And when you look at it in the quadrant sense, you'd really want to see this quadrant and this quadrant when you're looking. So delta in forecast is down here. So this is just looking at the market versus the ELF's forecast, and then this is looking at load conformance on this side. And the positive boxes is really this quadrant, and this quadrant would be kind of a positive. This quadrant and this quadrant would be, you know, maybe in the opposite direction. So when Guillermo was saying, you know, you have a load conformance of 400 megawatts, but at the same time your delta in your forecast was 40 megawatts, they're all in the same direction already. They're not in the opposite direction of each other. You can see on the chart, so you really see in RTPD that it's really a wash. You're really not seeing any defined pattern when you're looking for these two coordinates to show that is one way or the other. You are seeing in RTD, which makes sense based off of the previous graphs a little bit too, that there's more of a pattern, that there could be even more benefit in updating to the more near-term forecasts for ELF in the RTD sense. Just because of where there's a little bit more trend, but still not that much.
Ability distribution is. I mean, it might be good to understand how many data points there are in the various parts of that quadrant. Because when they're all on top of each other, you don't know if it's 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000. It's all just black.
And we can play with different type of portraying the data, and we actually look at the numbers, and that is where the 70% metric is coming. So it's very conclusive to see that 70% of the intervals is really moving along in the same direction. They are not offsetting each other. And again, the load conformance in isolation is an instrument that is used as a catch-all imbalance conformance for any reason, not just for issues with the load forecast. I would say load forecast, in the grand scheme of things, may be one of the smallest things that play a factor in the imbalance conformance. It's all about keeping your ACE, keeping your regulation in place, projecting the ramp, accounting for renewable resources. And that is the reason we were trying to see if there was any immediate consequence by implementing these fixes that we have observed. It was not the perfect timing season-wise to see those effects now.
So in summary of our findings, we are seeing that the ELF forecast is performing better than the market submitted forecast on average. The market submitted forecast is performing better in some intervals when you look at it in an averaged sense, such as during the morning turn of the load and at times during the evening peak. The market submitted forecast, and this is something that we didn't have a distinct graph on, but it's something that we've seen in the data that I wanted to make a point on. The market submitted forecast has less movement between RTD and RTPD, or even between the different RTD and RTPD runs. That was something that was found when looking at the flexible ramp requirements, but that's also something that you can kind of see, not as explicitly when you're looking at the error, because if you look at the two different ELF intervals, you can see the error change between 15 minutes out and 10 minutes out and 35 minutes out and 30 minutes out, which is indicating that there is movement in that forecast. So that forecast does move around a little bit more. So next steps for the ISO is we're going to continue to work with operations to automatically publish the ELF forecast updates during periods of obvious better performance and limited system reliability impact. And then we're also going to continue to work on the ELF load forecast in all intervals, including some of the key time intervals that we saw during this analysis, such as the morning turn. The morning turn, and there is a slide in the appendix to kind of talk through that. It's been something that is the most difficult to forecast in a short-term sense. There's two reasons for that. Right now, the reason for it is the marine layer. So the marine layer is burning off at differing times during the day. And because of the amount of rooftop solar penetration on the system, they will move around when that load is going to turn. So it's hard for an automated load forecast system when cloud cover forecasting is one of the more difficult challenges in the forecasting operations to be able to hit that one. And in the other seasons, the shoulder seasons, just the sunrise coming on and the partly cloudy situation of behind the meter also impacts the morning turn as well. And you see that cloud cover forecasting or rooftop solar forecasting has a lot of challenges during the same period of time of 9, 10 in the morning as when we're trying to turn the morning load. So we're going to continue to work on different ways to improve that in our behind-the-meter forecast models, working with research entities to improve cloud cover forecasting and marine layer forecasting. Just to go through some of the appendix slides, there's detailed equations on how the persistent method's working. Just an example from a couple weeks ago of even though you're going to have very similar temperatures for a specific area, how different the load shape ends up being just based off of the thickness and the burn off of the marine layer. I found these to be quite interesting. And then these are the distributions that Guillermo was talking about to show if there was a positive bias or a negative bias, and really there was inconclusive. It was not one way or the other way all the time. And this is in there for RDD and RGBD. And that's all I had.
That was great. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you.
So first we'll see if there are any questions, comments in the room. And operator, do we have any comments or questions for Amber on the lines?
There are no callers in queue at this time.
Okay, thank you. So looking forward to hearing more about the performance. I guess there'll be more information available Monday, the performance of the FRP itself and how this has hopefully made it more useful. And I appreciate the effort that you put into preparing this materials and presenting today.
All right, thank you guys.
Okay. So the last item on the agenda is new business, and I look left and I look right.
Have we ever had new business?
I don't recall ever, in the 20 years I've been involved with this, ever having new business, but I must ask. There seems to be none. So if that's the case, we will have the next MSC meeting for the consideration of our opinion on Track 1B, the CRR. And then I anticipate after that we're planning a meeting for in-person meeting here in Folsom on August 3rd, which is a Friday. And hopefully see most of you then. So at this point, operator, we are done, and you can disconnect us.
Thank you all for joining today's call. This event has concluded, and you may now disconnect.